So, a very good morning. Thanks for taking the time at this time of the day. Welcome to NEOS Lab. NEOS Lab is an open laboratory for new politics and the party academy of NEOS. My name is Josef Lentscher. I'm the director here, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Earl Fry. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science at Brigham Young University in Utah.
That's right.
He's also endowed professor of Canadian Studies at the same university. He got his MA at Brigham Young in 1972 and his PhD at the University of California in Los Angeles in 1976. His publications include The Forgotten Partnership and the Evolving US-Canada Trade and also das Freihandelsabkommen, die EU und die USA in 2014. So he knows TTIP very well, and we're looking forward to hearing from him his perspective, particularly, of course, the academic and the US perspective, where we are with TTIP and where we go with TTIP. The 12th round has just been finalized. The 13th round is about to begin. The 13th round will take place in the US. I'm sure you will have a lot of questions. I do, for certain. So for starters, I will ask Dr. Fry to kick us off with an impulse about 15, 20 minutes. And then, of course, we'll open it up for a moderated Q&A. Please help yourself to coffee and tea and to drinks and, of course, to pastries. Make yourself comfortable. And please give a hand to Dr. Earl Fry.
Thank you. I think what I'll do in terms of my introduction, talk a little bit about the U.S. economy right now, the fact that we're in an election campaign, which is very unusual, and then talk about TTIP, some of the main points, and then just take your questions, if that would be all right. You would think at this particular point in time that the U.S. economy is actually doing fairly well. We have, in the 5% unemployment rate, so that's down from 10% during the height of the Great Recession. We have had almost 1 million people join the workforce in the past 2 months, and about 2 million joined in the last 4 months, which is great because we've had, to be employed in the United States means that you're working at least 1 hour per month, not very high standards. And so, but we've had a lot of people that have been so discouraged that they have not even been looking for work. Now they're coming back, which is tremendous for us. So even though our unemployment rate went up from 4.9% to 5% this past month in March, that's good because so many more people have entered the workforce. So that's very much a positive. We've actually created 14.4 million new jobs in the United States since about February of 2010 through last month. And to explain that in greater detail, during the 1970s, we created over 20 million jobs in the United States. The 1980s, over 20 million. 1990s, over 20 million. And then during the first decade of the current century, 0. But now we're back on pace again. So here we're in the second decade, and it looks like we may create 20 million or more net new jobs during this current decade. Our wages are up 2.3% over the past 12 months. That's not great, but it's better than the inflation rate. And that, of course, is what we're looking for. Our annual growth rate in both 2014 and 2015 was 2.4%. And we think this year will probably grow a little bit higher than 2.4%. Not great, but growing. And our GDP is about $18,000 billion last year, about $18 trillion. So, these things look pretty good, but nonetheless, there are a lot of people worried in the United States. About 2/3 think that the country is still headed in the wrong direction. Over half of parents believe that the disposable income of their children when they become adults will be less than the parents have had. Our labor participation rate has gone up over the past couple of years to 63.0%, but that's still back to the level of about 1980. And one of our problems has been men. Back in about 1965, we had 97% of men between the ages of 25 and 54 in the workforce. In recent years, that's fallen back to 88%. And so we need to get them back into the workforce. And in particular, you have young men without a high school education that are struggling. Difficult to get a job, and if they get a job, the wages are not very high. Women doing relatively well. There's still some wage discrimination based on gender, but it's getting better. And the last thing, and this just came out a few days ago from the Pew Research Center, 46% of registered voters this year say that life today is worse than it was 50 years ago for people like them. That's 46%. And this helps, I think, to explain the phenomenon that we're finding with Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. There's a very important primary today. The primary is being held in the state of Wisconsin. It is possible, we don't know what the results will be, but it's possible that that Senator Cruz from Texas will actually beat Donald Trump in Wisconsin. And it's possible that Bernie Sanders from Vermont will beat Hillary Clinton today in Wisconsin. No, we don't know. It's pretty close, which in both cases would prolong the election campaign, which will finish up in terms of the primaries and the caucuses at the end of the first week of June, when California and some other states will be voting. So as I said, this is a very, very interesting campaign. For the moment, you would have to expect that Donald Trump will be the candidate for the Republican Party. They'll hold their their convention in Cleveland in July. And on the Democrats, it will be Hillary Clinton. And they'll hold their convention in Philadelphia in July. But you never know. Many Republicans do not want to see Donald Trump get the nomination. If he comes into Cleveland without a majority of the delegates, then there's a lot of Republicans that would like to see that vote go beyond the first ballot. And that hasn't happened among Republicans at their convention since 1948. And for Democrats since 1952. So we're going back a long ways there. And if you actually go beyond the first ballot, then that opens up to a lot of people perhaps being the nominee. For example, it could be Paul Ryan, who's the Speaker of the House in the House of Representatives. And so there's an effort underway to try to stop Trump, because a lot of the Republican establishment believe that if he is the nominee for the Republicans, there will be a disaster in November when we have the general election, that you could easily see the Democrats taking control of the United States Senate. You'd only need to have a shift of 4 seats. 1/3 of the senators are up for re-election. If you had a shift of 4, that would turn it back to the Democrats if Hillary Clinton becomes president. And you'd need a shift of 30 seats in the House of Representatives. That's more. There's 435 seats there up for re-election or election. But that could be done. So you could perhaps see in November Hillary Clinton as the President of the United States, and Democrats taking back control of both the United States Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives, now both controlled by the Republican Party. In addition, some of the establishment Republicans are worried that this will also filter down to the state level, where they might lose some governorships and also control of state legislatures, which they now have a majority. So you can see they're worried about Donald Trump. His negatives among the American people are the highest among any major candidate in decades. You know, just a lot of Americans saying there's no way I can vote for Donald Trump as President of the United States. Hillary Clinton actually has some fairly high negatives too, but not in the same range as Donald Trump. So this has been a strange year, as I said. You would expect that Donald Trump may get that majority. You know, he needs about 55% of the remaining delegates in order to do that. But if Cruz wins today in Wisconsin, you don't know. You know, Trump is expected to win in New York, his home state. He's ahead for the moment in California, the big states. He may do well in Pennsylvania. So he could well still be the nominee for the Republican Party, but there's a big question mark there. Now, in making the transition to looking at trade issues, this has been the most negative campaign in many, many years on trade. And most of the candidates coming out against free trade. They have come out against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. As you know, the United States is negotiating both TTIP, but even before that, the United States was negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that partnership, the TPP, a dozen countries involved. The major one in Asia would be Japan. All three NAFTA countries, North American Free Trade Agreement countries, are involved, plus some others in Latin America. And in effect, it's been agreed to. It was agreed to by the 12 countries in last October in Atlanta, Georgia. And it's been signed. It was signed this February in New Zealand. Now what is needed is ratification. And so most of the candidates and the American people, although they're not paying close attention at this time, when it comes to free trade agreements, they're focusing on the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what you have is basically Donald Trump, a Republican from a state normally free traders, or excuse me, from a party that's normally free traders, he basically says, no, I don't like it. Don't like the TPP. And Ted Cruz, who's second in terms of delegate count, is coming out and saying, I don't like it either. He's sort of a Tea Party member in the Republican Party, and they're much more skeptical about free trade. And on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders, who actually is an independent senator. He's a senator from Vermont, but he runs as an independent, not as a Democrat, even though he caucuses with the Democrats in the Senate. He is very much opposed, adamantly opposed, to both the TPP and to the TTIP. And Hillary Clinton, who was in favor as Secretary of State under President Obama, has now come out and said that she cannot accept it either. So this is about as negative as you get towards free trade as, in my memory, in many, many elections. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen? Well, there is some glimmer of hope here. If Hillary Clinton becomes president of the United States, which I anticipate will happen, and if Democrats take control of the two chambers of Congress, and maybe only the Senate, but not the House, what could happen then? Well, Hillary Clinton could sort of do what Bill Clinton did in 1994. Okay, now NAFTA, 1993, actually. NAFTA was negotiated by the first President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. And that was the agreement with the United States, Canada, and Mexico for a free trade area, which is the largest in the world, by the way, but not nearly as integrated economically as the EU. And so during the campaign of '92, Bill Clinton was against NAFTA. Said just can't accept it, doesn't do enough to protect workers, doesn't do enough to enhance environmental standards, said I can't do it. But when he became president of the United States in '93, he said, look, there's certain things that we could do to make NAFTA acceptable. We're going to add a labor commission, we're going to add an environmental commission, we're going to add a development bank, which will be geared towards helping Mexico. And so that was done, and he then supported the agreement. And it went up to Congress. This was under what we call the fast track. Today we call it Trade Promotion Authority, where both chambers will have to say yes, but without amendments. You know, and all you have to do is get 50% plus one vote in both chambers, which we now have in effect under Trade Promotion Authority today. And so what happened, he got together with a group of Republicans up on Capitol Hill, and he was able to get NAFTA ratified, even though a majority of members of his own party, the Democrats, voted against it in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Now, we could see perhaps a scenario, I'm not saying this is likely, but it could happen, that Hillary Clinton in 2017, or maybe later than that, would say, if we make these sort of changes in TTIP, of course, this is taken for granted that the EU is supportive and has agreed to some consultations on this. She said, I think we can now do TTIP in the United States. And she would join with a lot of traditional Republicans who are generally free traders and some Democrats and get it through the United States Congress in 2017. It's a little bit more complicated because now what you have among Republicans are the Tea Party advocates who tend to be skeptical about free trade agreements. And so it would be more difficult than it was back in 1993, but not impossible. So here is Hillary Clinton, who would become the next president, who was supportive of both the TPP and TTIP as Secretary of State under President Obama, now saying she's very skeptical, doesn't know if she could support such agreements, coming back in line after the election is over. Because you don't worry about Donald Trump any longer, he'll be gone. You know, and Bernie Sanders has been defeated, even though she's certainly taken into account some of his stances right now during the campaign. And he'll probably last, he can last almost up to the convention that the Democrats will have in Philadelphia in July, because he's got a lot of money. It's been a very, very significant campaign, because just this past month he raised over $40 million, just in 1 month, among small donors. And so the Sanders phenomena has been very, very interesting. You know, social democrat, and we don't have social democrats in the United States, you know, not in great number. But this is how maybe it could work out. And so even though there's a lot of negative publicity now associated with the campaign, we have this key election today in Wisconsin, this primary, you could still see where it might work out. Now, in terms of TTIP issues, we did have the trade minister in France a couple of weeks ago say there's 3 critical issues that the U.S. must go along with before the EU could ever agree to TTIP. And one would be this geographical identity, where the U.S. recognizes that Champagne actually is something from the Champagne region of France, and you got Roquefort cheese, and you got feta cheese. And for the U.S., it's a little bit difficult because we're not quite sure, what do we have in the way of geographical identification? Do we have, you know, Idaho potatoes? You know, what do we put up on this list? But this is one that is going to be discussed. As mentioned, we've had 12 rounds. The last one was February, going into March in Brussels, meeting this month in the United States, and then the 14th round will be in Brussels in July. And the hope for in the negotiating teams is by the time we get to the end of the summer, we've got a pretty good text in place, other than bracketed items, which are the ones that still need to be negotiated. And hoping that by the end of this year, or close to the end, sometime in the fall, that we would come up with an accord. Could it be passed by the U.S. Congress during this election campaign? No way. It just won't work. Could it be passed in the lame duck session that occurs after our election, but you still have the previous Congress in place until January? Not likely. Not likely. It's, you know, maybe remotely possible, but not likely. So that brings us into 2017, or even beyond that, in terms of any ratification of TTIP. So the geographical identification is one. The second, the trade minister said, would be government procurement. That's not so much of a problem at the federal level, but remember, we are a federal system like Germany, and to a certain extent like here in Austria. And the state governments do have constitutional authority to do a variety of things. And so Washington would have to bring on board the state governments in terms of government procurement. Now, there's certain things that Washington can do. For example, if there's federal money involved in a state government giving out a procurement contract, that Washington could say, well, if you're going to use federal money, you have to abide by these new standards in terms of government procurement. And also, I think the EU has to understand that some of these provisions in government procurement are, for example, we're going to set aside a certain number of contracts for African American business owners, you know, for our minority business owners. that if they come in with a bid about 10% within the best bid, that we're going to accept that bid. And basically what Europe is saying is you can't do that any longer. You can't have this provision where you set aside certain contracts for minority business owners. And so this will have to be negotiated. It's a delicate topic, but it's not that it's impossible. Maybe it can be done. And the third issue would be the state investment dispute settlement. Now, you have had in the EU dispute settlement for a long time in your free trade agreements. We have had it since 1994 with NAFTA. How we work it out in the United States and Canada and Mexico, if there's a dispute, let's say, between a U.S. company and a Canadian government, maybe a provincial government, although it will be the federal government that will take charge, we put together a roster of basically adjudicators. And if it were an American company involved, the United States would choose 2 of the people to be on the panel. Canada would choose 2. And then the other 4 would choose the 5th member. It doesn't have to be someone from North America, by the way. And then they would adjudicate and decide whether or not the American company's claim has any standing. And then there would be some sort of, if yes, then there would be some sort of compensation provided to the American company. What the EU, of course, is calling for is now this a professional adjudication body that would be permanent. One thing that has happened recently is that Canada, under Justin Trudeau, has come on board with the EU. See, the Canadians and the EU negotiated CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. And it's been in abeyance for a while because the EU has been negotiating with the United States. But the Canadians have now come on board saying we will go along with what the EU is calling for in terms of a permanent tribunal to resolve state investor disagreements. Now, how will the United States react? Well, we'll have to see. You know, that may have some weight, but not necessarily shift the balance on what will be agreed to. But I think because we've had state investment adjudication for so long, both within the EU and in NAFTA, that we could probably work it out. But those were the 3 basic elements that the French trade minister said you got to have the U.S. Give in, or at least make a major compromise on before we can do TTIP. And I do think that we can make some significant progress there. And remember what those 3 issues are. We're looking at geographical identification. We're looking at government procurement at all levels, federal, state, and local. And then on this 3rd issue on state investor dispute settlement. So that gives you a little bit of a background. One thing I would add at the end is, would this be good for Austrian companies, at least on the surface? The one thing to keep in mind, we're still looking at the United States as the world's largest economy, at least in nominal dollars. We're looking at the United States being the 2nd largest export partner of Austria after Germany. And we're looking at a United States that's going to continue to grow. In fact, the growth in the U.S. population between now and 2050 will be far greater than the growth in the entire EU population during that same period. The United States will move towards 400 million people by 2050. We have about 320 million right now. So you're looking at a growth in the world's largest economy. You're looking at a basically relatively affluent population. You're looking at a population which loves to consume. We don't save enough. We consume a whole lot, which you would think would be ideal for Austrian companies in terms of servicing that marketplace. So that's why overall, and this is just my opinion, I'm just an academic. I have been in government before. I was in the office of the United States Trade Representative back in the Reagan years a long time ago. I sort of think, I hope it will work it out, because that will move us in the direction of liberalized economic relations. And the other thing that really stands out, remember the Asian Development Bank a few years ago said if current conditions continue, and they've changed a little bit, it said if they continue, by 2050, a majority of the world's population and GDP and exports and foreign direct investment will be in Asia, which will change things rather dramatically from what we've had in place since the beginning of the 19th century, where there's been a transatlantic domination, so to speak. And not that Asia shouldn't do this, this is what they should be doing. But the one thing we want to make sure is that the transatlantic region remains very competitive, and more than that the rules of the game in the economy are basically market-based and also predicated on a foundation of democracy. And so it really does mean that we need to also become more competitive on both sides of the Atlantic, because we can see the challenges that are out there in terms of Asia-Pacific and the emerging markets, and we can do better. And we can certainly do better under the auspices of a liberalized regime headed towards free trade than we can towards, well, what we're basically hearing in the American campaign today about protectionism. Donald Trump says 35% tariff on Chinese goods coming into the United States. Big tariff on Mexican goods coming into the United States. That would end NAFTA right there. And so here we're into a day in the United States where we have this fever towards greater protectionism. And that would be terrible for the U.S. We did this back in 1930 with Smoot-Hawley, where we put tremendous tariffs on imports, basically saying we can take care of ourselves. You know, we can do Fortress America. We don't need to import. We can force Americans to buy American-made products. Well, what happened at the end of the day? We lost 20 years of our growth in our own exports, and eventually we lost 20 years of our growth in our standard of living. Smoot-Hawley was an absolute disaster in real terms. And we're hearing a little bit of this in the current campaign. Become more protectionist. We can take care of ourselves. And that's absolutely the wrong direction which the United States should be headed in. And if we can do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if we can do the TTIP, that will move us away from this sort of thinking towards, you know, much more consultation with our friends, working towards a liberalized trade and investment administration for the future. And with that, let me stop and take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Presidential elections are a funny thing. We also have a campaign at the moment in Austria, of course, and there are also some candidates who had been pro-free trade in the past and suddenly aren't anymore so much. So you said we might have a negotiated text by the end of the year, and also the EU chief negotiator, of course, said we are ready to seek to conclude our negotiations by the end of the year. So if you would have to put is it not on? Is it now on? No? Is it now on? Should I take a clear? Sure. If you would, thanks. It's not for in here, just so you know, it's for the live stream, because otherwise people won't understand, won't hear on the web. So if you would have to put a percentage number on it, how possible, what's the percentage of getting a negotiated agreement by the end of the year? Where would you put that?
Well, from the U.S. Vantage point, I would think that it's possible. A lot depends on the European reaction because once you get to those bracketed items, well, these are the tough issues. You know, you're going to have to find that there's going to be some movement on both sides. And I have the idea that there will be some movement on the U.S. side, and if that's meant by a comparable movement in terms of some compromise within the EU, then I think that we can come up with an agreement. Of course, coming up with an agreement, and again, we already have an agreement on the TTIP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then having it ratified, those are two different things. But I do think that it is possible, and the percentage, I would say maybe 50% at least. that we could come up with an agreement by the end of the year, but that may spill over into 2017. That's certainly a possibility, and certainly ratification would spill over to 2017, or even maybe a little bit beyond that.
I thought it was very interesting what you said about, that a lot of skepticism being in the US, particularly among the candidates, but also among the voters. I think in Europe we have the idea that the US is very pro-free trade, and that the US really wants to get this done, and that Europe is always on the brake. And I think that somehow contrasts with what you said. What's your perspective from the other side?
Right. Well, the thing is, even though we're talking about more protectionism right now, during the campaign, the foundation is still there for an agreement, because roughly 2/3 of Americans say that the U.S. should be engaged in international economic negotiations. Now, a fair number say the U.S. has lost some standing in the world. This comes from the Pew survey, and that has happened. I mean, we're not as dominant as we once were. We're a superpower, but not as strong as we once were. And I've written a book about this, and still very, very powerful nation. But when it comes to the trade issues or the economic issues, it said we have to be engaged, about 2/3. So that helps to mitigate some of this negative rhetoric that's coming out during the current campaign, because Americans basically say, we can't go it alone on economic issues. We need to cooperate with others. And so that probably will help us down the line, and particularly when we get past this current campaign, which will, of course, end in November. And that, as I said, if we have a President Hillary Clinton coming into office in January, that will, I think, also give her more impetus to try to move on both the TPP and the TTIP. And I would expect, by the way, that if there is a vote in Congress, the first vote will be on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because that was negotiated well before. It's about ready to go. And if that goes through, then I would expect the TTIP to go through. One thing that some members of Congress are calling for is some way to penalize using currency devaluations as a trade tool, meaning that you lower the value of your currency so that you can export more. And I think that this is much more germane to the TPP than it would be towards TTIP, even though you do have a variety of currencies other than the euro in play. But even looking at the issue, I'm not sure how you handle what we call currency manipulation. And some may argue that the U.S., our Federal Reserve, engaged in quantitative easing that went from about $1 trillion in holdings to over $3 trillion. Maybe was that basically currency manipulation, as we tried to bring down interest rates, and bringing down interest rates, that generally means that you're bringing down the value of your currency vis-a-vis other currencies. So, it's a very, very difficult issue. But I do think maybe because you have that residue of good feeling towards basically negotiating the trade agreements among the American populace, that once we get out of the weeds of the presidential and congressional campaigns, that we could get back onto more solid ground moving into 2017.
We had a brief chat before the event, and I told you that one of the issues we are having as a party with the whole process of negotiations is that it's very intransparent, and that's also for I think all of Europe, that's quite an issue. One of our representatives was in a reading room, and he blogged about it, that actually you only get 2 hours. You cannot take, well, you can take notes, but you cannot take anything with you. You cannot take any photographs. It's a lot of material to digest, much too much material for 2 hours. So I mean, for us, that's really important. Again, kind of contrasting it with the US perspective on that, how much of an issue is transparency, and do you think the Europeans they're having their issues there, but actually that's just how you do it. So are we oversensitive there from your perspective, or do you also have concerns?
Well, I think you need to be sensitive, and certainly some of that has been expressed among some of those opposed to TTIP in the United States. Most Americans are not that much aware of what TTIP is. It's below the radar screen. You know, we've been negotiating, gone through the 12 rounds. We have 2 more rounds scheduled through July, but most Americans are not aware. If they're aware of anything, they're aware of the TPP, because that's been, it's the TPP that's been discussed in the campaign, not so much TTIP. And actually, this isn't bad if you're a supporter of TTIP to have it below the radar, because it would be nice to come up with the agreement and then present it. You're right about transparency, but this is the most transparent agreement that I've ever seen, and I've been involved in trade negotiations since the 1980s. If you go on the Commission site, it's amazing how much information is available on the EU Commission site. If you go on the USTR, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative site, there's a lot there as well. Plus, under the Trade Promotion Authority in the United States, the President will give Congress notice that he's going to sign an agreement, but then there's 90 days. There's 90 days involved there when the entire agreement is going to be out there, and before Congress has to act. And so there will be total transparency. Now, one could argue we would like to have much more time than that. You know, the 2 hours in the reading room is not enough, and I can definitely understand that. But this is the most transparent major agreement that we've ever negotiated in our history. Not that we couldn't do better. And that, again, that 90 days will be there for the world to look at. You know, this is, you have all the sections that will be there, all the chapters will be there. And again, when it comes to the Trade Promotion Authority vote, it's up and down in the Congress. You know, they'll either accept it or they're going to throw it out. And everything is there. Everything's on the table. So, you know, there will be complete transparency. A lot of people would like to see it before that 90 days, but it will be out there. And what we do have now is greater than we've ever had before. So that at least, you know, not that it couldn't be better, but at least is a step in the right direction, and particularly for those concerned about total transparency.
So one other question before I hand it over to you, ladies and gentlemen. You mentioned the dispute settlements and the permanent tribunal, and that's also something that NEOS has. We have it in our program, actually. We had it quite from the beginning. So you said Canada came on board under Justin Trudeau. We love Justin Trudeau. Everybody loves Justin Trudeau these days, I think. So my question is, how probable do you think it is that the US will come on board with that as well?
I think there's going to be some very intense discussions. Back when the NAFTA tribunal was put into effect, by the way, there's only 2 countries in the world that have access to the dispute settlement mechanism that we have in NAFTA, only Canada and Mexico. And again, it's a very elaborate process. And even after it went into effect, we had a number of US senators said, well, I'm sorry we did that, because they felt it took away some of the power that they had over disputes like this, and also our court system had. I thought it was good, because sometimes we try to do things after an agreement has been made to change the rules of the game. In this case, we had to live by the rules. And remember, in our NAFTA dispute settlement, you abide by the rules which are now in place. You don't make new rules. So if that one company is suing the other government, you know, it's based on what the rules are in place. It's not a supranational institution. But even with that, we had some senators saying, nah, sorry that we did it. But, you know, I just think that since we've had it in place for so long, generally it's worked for the United States, that maybe there would be less opposition. But there's going to be some tough negotiations on what would be accepted. You know, Canada basically coming on board, that sort of gives some momentum to the EU proposal. But we'll have to see what's being done in terms of the negotiations between Brussels and Washington, D.C. I think it's doable. If it's not doable, they would basically cast it aside, and we would move towards more of a TTIP light. But I hope we don't do that. I hope it's a very comprehensive agreement.
So in diplomatic language, this, what you just said, reads, with both sides having textual proposals on the table now, the first discussion took place in an open and constructive atmosphere. So I think there's quite a long way to go, as you mentioned, but we're hopeful that we will reach an agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where you have the chance to make a comment or ask a question. Please just raise your hand. We have a roving mic, and just mention your name and state your comment or ask a question, please.
Thank you, Professor Fry, for being with us today. My name is Günther Kreuzhuber of NEOS. I have a question about American politics. I think we are all quite surprised by the success of Donald Trump in the primaries. You know, one of the judges of the Supreme Court passed away a couple of weeks ago, and President Obama put up his candidate, and the GOP said, we won't even discuss him because we want to wait, you know, till after the next elections. So this is, for me, this is one example of very destructive and behavior of the GOP. Also, we had the discussion of Obamacare, you remember, of more control of guns. So I was thinking, is Donald Trump really out of sync with the GOP, or is it just a logical, you know, development of the Republicans that the Republican Party as such is purely destructive and not trying to, you know, come to an agreement with the Democratic Party, or is he really so? So he's not coming as a surprise. Huh? He's like a logical development in American politics.
Very good. You know, that's a good question. Basically, a lot of Americans are disgusted with politics within Washington, D.C. You know, they feel there's been far too much gridlock. They say we have problems, let's solve our problems, and we're not doing it. And so, I mean, the popularity rating of Congress today is about 12%. That's not very high. It's been down as far as 9% in recent years. So there's a disgust being showed with politics as usual. In addition, many Americans still understand they were in bad straits a few years ago during the Great Recession. We just had caucuses in Nevada. And then the exit polls show that a lot of people, the one term they used was anger. They were angry with what's going on. And part of the reason why there's so much anger in Nevada, during the Great Recession, in particular in our sand states, which are Florida and California and Arizona and Nevada, things got really tough. Now, the wealth of the typical American household is based on three things. You know, having a job. And of course, we got up to a 10% unemployment rate, and they were worried about their job security. The second was if they were homeowners, what equity they have in their homes. And in the case of Las Vegas, the major city in Nevada, over 50% of homeowners that had mortgages were underwater. They owed far more on their mortgage than they could sell their houses for. And the third would be their pensions. And at that time, you know, pensions are significantly linked to Wall Street. And the Dow Jones Industrial Average during the worst time in the recession actually went below 7,000. Remember, today it's close to 18,000. And so they were really worried. You know, what's happening to me? What's happening to my family? Am I going to be able to keep my home? And that residue of unease is still there. You know, saying, why didn't you protect us, Washington? You know, why did we go through this terrible period? Why aren't you doing anything to help us? And I think this helps to explain the rightist populism and the leftist populism manifested by both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. On the left, they're saying, hey, we don't like the way things are being done. We don't like business as usual. And the big surprise, however, is that it's been so enduring. I mean, Donald Trump, who's been a Democrat, he's been a Republican, he's been an independent. You know, he's sort of a Johnny-come-lately Republican. You know, he's basically has latched on to this concern among a fair number of Americans. Remember what I said, that quote, you know, 46% saying, you know, well, 50 years ago, people like me were better off. And in the left, among progressives, as we call them, you know, a lot of people have been attracted to Bernie Sanders and not to Hillary Clinton, who's more of an establishment Democrat. And so it's been interesting to see how long this has lasted. And keep in mind as well that more Americans identify as independents than they identify as either Democrats or Republicans. So you can see there's unease, there's malaise among the American public, and this is carried over in terms of the support for Donald Trump, who basically says, I'll make America great again, When it comes to trade negotiations, I'll take charge because Washington doesn't know how to do trade negotiations. But then outlandish statements like, I wouldn't mind if NATO ends tomorrow. You know, I wouldn't mind if Japan and South Korea get their own nuclear weapons. This is Donald Trump. A lot of this over the past 7 to 10 days. And so you're right. It's really interesting that Trump has lasted as long as he has, and Bernie Sanders as well, because he's tapping into an issue there too. And it could well be that Trump will be the Republican nominee. And so, you know, things are not all well within the United States, particularly when it comes to government decision-making. Americans like to solve problems. They tend to be pragmatic. They're not very ideological, but they want to solve problems, and they're basically saying Washington is an impediment to solving problems. Now, it's very interesting as well to say that President Obama, who's a lame duck president, who languished in his support rating was about the low 40% range through much of the past few years, has suddenly got beyond 50% in terms of his approval rating. And I think that basically is due to people, Americans are watching Trump in particular, and the other candidates as well, and saying, you know, Obama looks pretty good, you know, in comparison to these guys. And his approval rating is now basically to the level a little bit higher than Ronald Reagan's approval rating was during his last year in office. So as I said, this is a very interesting election year. And definitely you're right. It has been surprising to many people, including me, that in particular that Donald Trump has lasted as long as he has and may actually become the nominee for the Republicans.
But it's also interesting what you say. As you know, I think our image in Europe is that the US have been much more rigorous in going about the crisis and, you know, letting banks go bankrupt, which we haven't, and also have come out of the crisis much more successfully with you know, more economic growth, and we're still stagnating here.
Right.
So it's interesting that there's still so much discontent, even though, you know, in comparison we think actually you're a role model in terms of how you deal with crisis and manage them. There is another question.
Christoph Itzani. I'm really passionate about free trade, and I think it's instrumental to the wealth of nations. But there is one thing about the TTIP and also the TPP that was a little bit, in your nice introduction, wasn't mentioned, and that's intellectual property. And we know now the provisions of the TPP, and there are some troubling things there where the US tries, or what I have the impression that the US tries to impose their ideas of intellectual properties on other countries. I think that the patent system, for example, in the US is pretty toxic to some industries. For example, the IT industry, where it really is stifling innovation. And also there is, in the copyright area, there is the Donald Duck effect, that every time that Donald Duck would enter the public domain, the time of copyright is extended. And of course, we don't know anything about the provisions that will be in TTIP because it's not transparent, but we know what the US, what is in the TPP. So judging on past actions, that's probably the best prediction what will be in the TTIP.
Right.
And I think that's, at least for me, and the problem is that these IP policies, they usually are very often then also used to curtail basic citizen rights, like to allow for surveillance to find out who's pirating content and things like that. What is your take on this? Do you think that I also think that maybe in this case the EU doesn't put up a fight as it should? But what is your take on this topic?
Okay. Well, I think that maybe there can be at least some compromise when it comes to intellectual property when we're dealing with patents and trademarks and copyrights. Maybe this would be a way in our current negotiations to at least, you know, settle some outstanding issues. We do have one about extending far greater patent protection to certain types of pharmaceuticals. which I personally oppose. You know, now this is only a certain class. On the other hand, you have to provide some intellectual property protection in order for businesses to recoup their investments and to make a profit. So I'm hoping that there may be some movement, still predicated on the notion that if someone does invent something, that there needs to be some protection. But as I said, particularly when it comes to pharmaceuticals, I think there is some move for movement there, more towards the EU position. This is just my personal notion, while still maintaining the notion, hey, you know, we know, you know, the U.S. tends to be very inventive. It tends to do very well in terms of entrepreneurialism. In many ways, you want to reward that. You want to move towards innovation in that. But on the other hand, not to the extent that you basically crowd out other people after a number of years. For example, in my case, I look at 15 potential problem areas in the United States. One would be healthcare. In the U.S., we spend almost 18% of GDP on healthcare. No one else even comes close to spending that much, and our outcomes are about the same or not even quite as good. And one of the problems would be the cost of pharmaceuticals. You know, and so you want to allow some protection, but on the other hand, after a number of years, you want to allow the generics to come in so that you can bring down the cost of health care, which we need dramatically in the U.S. I mean, with that almost 18% spending, we have millions and millions of Americans without any health care insurance at all. And that's the #1 cause of bankruptcy in the U.S. So there are areas there that I think we need to move on in the U.S. And if we can do something within the TTIP structure, which will move us toward this direction, you know, still honoring the notion of innovation and protection, but doing it in a reasonable way in terms of how many years of protection will be provided. Because there's no doubt that there's lobbying going on in the U.S. among members of Congress and the administration to say, give us as much protection as we can have, but we have to be reasonable as well, because we have to look at, well, how will consumers be affected both in Europe and the United States. And so we have to be, I think, pretty rational about this and be willing to make it certain compromises.
Is there a question from the stream? There is.
Actually, two. The first one is, what is plan B for the US if TTIP would not get through? Shall I read the second one out?
Yeah.
So the first one is, if TTIP does not get through.
What's the plan B?
If,
okay, plan B.
If it doesn't get through.
Okay.
And the second one is, what is the consequence for TTIP if Clinton does not get the nomination because of further investigation or even charge? What would a Ted Cruz mean for TTIP?
Very good. Well, the first one, if TTIP, basically, if both of us decide to just walk away or suspend negotiations, you know, that could happen. The worst possible scenario would probably be if the U.S. Congress says yes to the TPP and Europe says no to TTIP. That would move the U.S. more towards Asia, you know, which is not, what in the scheme of things is not good, because we need to have a very strong transatlantic policy. And not just in the economic arena, we need it in the political, strategic. And so that would be the worst. I mean, if both of us were to agree that we just can't do it now, maybe we'll come back in a couple of years, we can live with that, although that's not the best solution. So that's, you know, that certainly is a possibility. In terms of Hillary Clinton is not elected as president, well, if it were Bernie Sanders who would defeat her, there would be no TTIP. There would be no TPP. He is very much protectionist, extremely protectionist. If it were Donald Trump, he said he would negotiate himself. So what does that mean? So there would not be, I don't think there would be a TTIP in the foreseeable future. If it were Ted Cruz, it becomes more doubtful. Because Ted Cruz, he's a Republican, which looks good in terms of free trade tradition. He used to be a free trader. But as a Tea Party advocate, he's much more skeptical about free trade. So that would make TTIP more difficult. Maybe not impossible, but it would make it more difficult to get TTIP ratified. First of all, having the president accept it and send up a package to Congress. So the best bet, actually, is Hillary Clinton for the moment, to actually see TTIP go into effect sometime in the next few years.
Thank you. Any more questions? There in the front row.
Good morning, my name is Theresa Reiter. In terms of the investment dispute settlement system, could you maybe say a little bit more about the advantages and disadvantages of the permanent tribunal as it is envisaged now?
Well, if both sides were to agree to a permanent tribunal and those who would serve as judges, you know, that we would probably be in pretty good shape, you know. And as I said, in the U.S., we actually have a roster that you can choose from. And so, you know, that's certainly not permanent, not the way that the EU is talking about, but, you know, it certainly is possible that it could work. I guess, as I said, there's some skepticism that would be expressed, particularly in the United States Senate, about giving such a tribunal, which they would consider to be supranational. You remember American, particularly, well, a lot of Americans are jealous of sovereignty. And particularly in the U.S. Senate, the notion was we don't want to give up any sovereignty. You know, remember, we never even joined the League of Nations in the United States back in the 1920s, and in part because the Senate said, well, because of the collective agreement accord on defense, you know, I mean, coming to the aid of a member of the League of Nations who was under attack, that would take away the war-making power of the United States Senate. And even though Woodrow Wilson pushed dramatically for U.S. inclusion in the League of Nations, and he was sort of the architect of it, it almost killed him, because he spent so much time on the road trying to get voters to convince their members of the Senate to vote in favor. He had a stroke, and during the last year or so in office, he was sort of a vegetable almost. His wife was almost the acting president at the time. So you can see this jealousy towards protecting sovereignty. So I think it would lead to some opposition in the Senate. The big question there, would it be enough opposition? Now, you know, in theory, it's workable. You know, coming up with a tribunal, both sides agree on who the judges will be. In theory, it's workable, but there would be some resistance, I think, coming from Capitol Hill. And we just have to see if there's enough resistance. And how would the president say this is in the long term, this is actually in our favor, let's go along with it. So if the U.S. president were in favor, that may melt some of the opposition in the Senate, but there's still going to be some there. So it's a tricky issue. It's a tricky issue, and it has been historically in the United States to try to maybe give away some of the power that once belonged to the legislative branch, bringing it to an international tribunal. So it's, like I said, it would be difficult.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ulrich Meyer. I don't know if you have into this specific sector that I'm asking now. In Europe, I think the most concerns and doubts regarding TTIP is coming up when it comes to terms of food and agriculture. Yeah. Since I think Austria, I guess we're one of the world-leading countries when it comes to organic agriculture and very low industrialized. Or I mean, we are industrialized, but we have very small units, not so much large companies or like Cargill or not so great. I don't think we have such a great industrialized agriculture. Right. Even though, of course, subsidies from the European Union are as high, I think, as from the US for their agricultural sector. So my question would be: do you think there's a chance for common standards in this sector without changing the whole agricultural system in Europe or also in the US? Or do you think both sectors have to change in terms also of subsidies? Do we have to get rid of subsidies at all? Or how do you think we can get a common sense on agriculture in the US and Europe?
Yeah, this is a touchy issue for me and for everyone else, I guess, because agriculture has always been the problem, not just in bilateral negotiations, but in multilateral negotiations. I think maybe we can at least see some movement, you know, when it comes to the GMOs, that if there's clear scientific evidence that there may be some problems, and then, you know, Americans don't want to buy those products either. But on the other hand, there has to be scientific evidence, clear scientific evidence. In terms of the small farms, you know, there are niches there that would be available. You already have Austrian farmers that are doing pretty well in their exports to the United States, and if anything, that should be a growing market. In terms of the subsidies, I mean, here I'm pretty much of a free trader. I would like to see the United States get rid of many of their subsidies, particularly the ones that don't make any sense. I mean, we provide subsidies to peanut farmers. You know, of course, Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer. I've been to his farm, you know, I don't see why we continue to do that. And the worst case is sugar cane and sugar beet farmers. We pay about twice the world price for sugar in the United States. We should buy them all out, you know, and then allow American consumers to buy at the world price. So that you can see my bias there. But in other areas, you know, there would have to be some compromise, there's no doubt, and some may be off the table. So I think we can make some progress. We're not going to make total progress. You know, that's just the way it goes, and we understand this from agricultural negotiations in the past. But I think we can come up with a compromise, and in some cases it will be that we know your products are world class, we know they're safe, they're going to enter the U.S. You know that certain products in the United States, agricultural products, are world class and they're safe. They're going to enter the European Union, and we'll recognize one another's standards there. And so there's a way that we can work it out, even though there will be some parts of agriculture that will probably be left aside. You know, we just can't reach an agreement. And we did that in NAFTA. In NAFTA, we did that. There's certain things, and we did some, you know, like, for example, Mexicans are the #1 growers of avocados in the world. And we did allow them access, but we did provide some protection to California and Florida avocado growers. You know, certain things like this. We had a 15-year period of phasing in on certain agricultural products. And so there's lots that can be done to ease some of the concerns in agriculture, even though, as I said, in some areas we just won't reach an agreement, leave it off the table.
Thanks a lot. If there are no more questions, we have one more from the stream.
So, can you hear me? Yeah. Do you think the longer the negotiations last, the cronier TTIP gets, or deviates away from free trade?
So the longer the negotiations last, the more sort of crony, was that?
Yeah, the cronier TTIP gets.
I think it would be nice.
Deviates away from free trade.
Yeah, I think it would be nice to wrap them up at the end of this year or moving into 2017. Not that it wouldn't be possible to do something later on, but the questioner may be right about that. This sort of may solidify opposition in certain areas as certain companies lobby or certain industries lobby for greater protection. So if I had my druthers, I'd like to see us get it wrapped up by the end of this year or moving into 2017, and then move into the ratification process. So we have the momentum now. We have the TPP that already has provided sort of a shield for what we're doing in TTIP, and so there's a template that's already there. And if we can get that TPP ratified, then I really do think that clears a way for the TTIP to go forward, at least in the United States, you know, getting it ratified. And it's better to do it now than later on.
And with this, we wrap up this morning's edition of Meet the Expert with Dr. Earl Fry. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting and very insightful. Thanks for coming and taking the time. Just saying that next week, we also have a very exciting week ahead of us. On the 11th, we have in the evening an event on the ECB and its politics, which will be great and has a great panel. Then on the 13th, we have a lunch, pink bag lunch on the US presidential elections. And then on the 14th, we have in the evening an event with Robert Menasse, Angelika Mlina, and Hans Stein on Europe, where are we headed. So it's going to be a great week ahead. You can register, of course, on our website as always. Thanks very much. Thank you again, sir, and have a great day.
Good. Thank you.